Emily Parker never thought loneliness could exist inside a marriage, yet it quietly followed her through the rooms of her own home. She lived with her husband, Daniel, in a neat suburban house in Washington state, a place that looked peaceful from the outside but felt hollow within. Daniel was successful, disciplined, and respected, but over the years he had grown distant, as if his heart was always somewhere else. Their conversations became short, practical, and empty, filled with schedules instead of feelings. Emily tried to hold on to small hopes, shared dinners, weekend plans, gentle touches, but each attempt faded into silence. She spent long evenings alone, listening to the hum of the house, wondering how two people could drift so far apart without a single argument. Everything changed the night Daniel invited his old college friends over for a casual gathering. Michael, Ryan, and Luke arrived with easy laughter and warmth, bringing energy Emily hadn't felt in years. They talked openly, joked freely, and treated her like she was more than a background presence. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt seen, and that feeling startled her. Daniel watched from across the room, quiet and unreadable, sipping his drink without joining the conversation. Emily noticed his eyes linger on her as she laughed, not with anger or jealousy, but with a strange calm that made her uneasy. As the night went on, she felt a pull between guilt and comfort, unsure why simple kindness felt so powerful. When the friends finally left, the house returned to silence, heavier than before. Emily waited for Daniel to speak, to ask questions, to show concern, but he said nothing. He simply went upstairs, leaving her alone with thoughts she couldn't escape. Lying awake later, Emily realized this was the first night she truly understood how fragile her marriage had become. There was no dramatic fight, no betrayal, no shouting, just quiet distance and a growing awareness that something essential was missing. The cracks were small but deep, and she sensed that if they were ignored any longer, they would soon break everything apart. After that night, something inside Emily shifted, and the days began to move faster, heavier, as if her life had quietly stepped onto a path she hadn't chosen but couldn't leave. Daniel continued his routine without change, leaving early, coming home late, speaking little, and when he did speak his words were careful and distant, like he was afraid of touching something fragile. His friends kept visiting, sometimes together, sometimes one by one, always invited by Daniel himself, which confused Emily more than anything else. Michael was the easiest to talk to, calm and thoughtful, asking simple questions about her day and actually listening to the answers. Ryan brought humor and lightness, making her laugh when she had almost forgotten how. Luke was quieter, more observant, noticing her moods without saying much, offering presence instead of words. None of them crossed clear lines, yet every moment felt charged with something unspoken. Emily told herself it was harmless, just conversation, just attention, but her heart knew it was more than that. She began dressing with more care when they were around, fixing her hair, choosing softer colors, feeling both guilty and alive. Daniel saw all of it and said nothing. His silence became a shadow in the room, following her from the kitchen to the living room, from laughter to quiet pauses. One evening, Emily finally asked him if he was uncomfortable with how close everyone had become, and Daniel simply shrugged and said he trusted her, his voice flat, almost rehearsed. That answer didn't bring comfort, it brought fear. Trust should feel warm, not empty. As the weeks passed, emotional lines blurred further. Conversations lingered late into the night, eyes held contact longer than they should, and Emily felt pulled in different directions, craving connection while fearing the cost. She tried to reconnect with Daniel, suggesting dinners, walks, shared time, but he declined gently, always tired, always busy, always distant. It felt like he had stepped aside from his own marriage. Emily began to realize that the attention she received wasn't the cause of the distance but a result of it. She wasn't seeking excitement, she was seeking acknowledgement. Still, the weight of it all pressed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She noticed how Daniel watched her interactions without emotion, almost like an observer instead of a partner, and that unsettled her deeply. It was as if he had quietly accepted losing her before she herself understood what was happening. One night, after everyone left, Emily stood alone in the kitchen, staring at her reflection in the dark window, barely recognizing the woman she saw. She wasn't reckless or cruel, she was lonely and confused, caught in a space where affection felt dangerous but absence felt worse. In bed beside Daniel, she lay awake while he slept, wondering when love had turned into distance and how neglect could hurt as much as betrayal. Part of her hoped Daniel would finally react, would show anger or fear, anything that proved he still cared. Another part feared that moment had already passed. By the end of those weeks, Emily understood that something had already broken, not through action but through silence, and she sensed that the next step, whatever it might be, would change everything forever. The tension that had been quietly building between Emily, Daniel, and his friends finally became impossible to ignore, a weight that pressed on Emily's chest every time she tried to breathe normally in her own home. She realized that what she felt around Michael, Ryan, and Luke wasn't about temptation or desire in the usual sense, it was about being seen, being valued, being noticed after years of fading into the background of her own marriage. Every conversation with them, every shared laugh, every thoughtful glance became an electric reminder of the attention she had been starving for. Daniel's continued silence made it all worse. He never interrupted, never asked questions, never drew boundaries, and in that inaction, Emily began to feel both relief and shame. One evening, after a particularly long night filled with easy laughter and meaningful conversations with Michael and Ryan, Emily could no longer keep the storm inside her silent. She turned to Daniel, her voice trembling with both anger and sadness, asking why he never stepped in, why he never cared enough to stop things from slipping. Daniel's answer was quieter than she expected. He admitted he no longer knew how to love her in the way she deserved, that over the years, he had drifted emotionally, and that watching her find warmth elsewhere felt easier than confronting his own failures. His words were calm, almost detached, but they cut deeper than any argument could. Emily felt a mix of sorrow, relief, and heartbreak, sorrow for the years lost in quiet neglect, relief in finally hearing the truth, and heartbreak for realizing that their love had eroded not from passion or anger, but from absence and inattention. She understood then that marriage required active choice every day, and when that choice was no longer made, even trust could become fragile. Emily's mind raced with memories of small moments overlooked, kind gestures unreciprocated, conversations left unfinished, and nights spent longing for connection that never came. She saw clearly that the emotional distance, the unattended needs, and the quiet withdrawal of love had created the space where she had turned to others for acknowledgement, not for betrayal, not for excitement, but for validation of her existence. The realization was painful. She felt as if she had been living in a house made of glass, watching her life shatter in silence while Daniel observed without moving to catch the pieces. At the same time, she recognized that holding on to guilt or blaming herself would accomplish nothing. She had to face the truth. Their marriage was no longer a partnership but a pattern of quiet abandonment. That night, Emily made a small, invisible promise to herself that she would no longer let neglect define her life. She would confront reality, seek clarity, and find her own way forward, even if it meant stepping into uncertainty. The realization that betrayal doesn't always wear the mask of passion but can hide behind indifference shook her to the core. She also realized that her heart had grown stronger in these painful lessons, understanding that true love required courage, effort, and presence, and that when those elements disappeared, even loyalty and trust became fragile. The emotional storm left her exhausted yet awake, aware that the next choices she made could either heal or destroy her completely. In the silence of that night, Emily decided she could no longer wait for Daniel to act, to love her fully, or to bridge the growing chasm between them. She understood that some stories don't end with reconciliation but with recognition of what has been lost, and the courage to move forward. The awareness of that truth was both terrifying and liberating, and as she drifted into a restless sleep, Emily felt the first faint glimmer of clarity about how her life might continue, no longer defined by the absence of attention but by her own choice to reclaim her identity, dignity, and sense of self. Emily woke the next morning with a quiet determination she hadn't felt in years. The weight of confusion, longing, and silent betrayal that had hung over her like a thick fog suddenly felt more like clarity than pain. She realized that staying in a home where love had turned into distance, where she was left to seek validation from others because her husband had stepped away emotionally, would never bring her happiness. Daniel remained the same, distant, calm, almost passive, but this time, Emily no longer sought his approval or waited for him to act. She began making plans to leave, not in anger or rebellion, but with the steady awareness that her life, her heart, and her happiness were hers alone to protect. Over the next few days, she packed quietly, choosing what mattered, keeping memories that felt safe and letting go of those tied to sorrow. She visited her sister in Vancouver, seeking comfort in family and the familiarity of a supportive presence, and for the first time in years, she felt like herself again, seen, valued, alive. Emily reflected on the months she had spent in her marriage, recognizing that the emotional neglect had not been dramatic or cruel, but the absence of engagement had created a space where her soul felt invisible. Daniel did not stop her, did not plead or question, and she realized that his detachment had been a silent agreement that their marriage had already ended in spirit. Walking through the familiar streets of Vancouver, surrounded by people who cared in spaces that felt welcoming, Emily felt a mixture of sorrow and relief. She grieved what could have been, yet she celebrated the courage to finally choose herself. The lessons she carried were heavy but necessary, that love requires presence, effort, and courage, and without those, even loyalty becomes fragile, and even years of shared life cannot guarantee happiness. Emily understood that her connection with Daniel's friends had never been about betrayal in the common sense. It had been a reflection of what she had been missing: attention, kindness, human warmth, and that seeking those things was not wrong when the person who should have given them had stepped aside. She learned that walking away was not an act of vengeance but an act of self-respect, a statement that she would no longer exist in the shadows of someone else's indifference. As days turned into weeks, Emily rebuilt her life with quiet strength, making choices guided by clarity instead of fear, opening herself to relationships and experiences that nurtured rather than diminished her. Daniel remained behind in the empty house, a silent observer of the life that had moved on without him, and Emily realized that sometimes the deepest lessons of love come from noticing the absence of it. She wrote letters she never sent, released emotions she had held for years, and allowed herself to dream again. In the calm of her new home, with the gentle Vancouver breeze brushing against the window, Emily finally understood that healing begins the moment someone chooses themselves, and that courage, self-respect, and hope are the first true acts of love a person can offer to themselves.